So we're going to move on now to our third speaker, Grace Neville, Professor Grace Neville, who studied at University College Cork and at the Université de Caen and the Université de Lille, where she did her doctorate. She is Professor Emeritus of French at UCC, where she was also Vice President for Teaching and Learning. Her research focuses inter alia on Franco-Irish relations from the medieval to the modern period. Since retiring from UCC in 2012 at a ridiculously young age, she has been a member or the chair of numerous boards and committees in France, for instance in the Agence nationale de la recherche and the Ministère de l'enseignement supérieur, de la recherche et de l'innovation, as well as at universities including the Sorbonne, Rennes, Cergy Pontoise and Aix-Marseille, and also at the European Commission. She holds the Légion d'honneur and the Palmes Académiques. Grace has the great distinction of making virtually anything she talks about utterly stimulating. So don't let me down now. Today, Grace, your subject is De Jour en Jour, glimpses of the lives of Irish students in the schools and colleges of 19th century France.
Merci infiniment, cher ami. Je voudrais tout d'abord remercier très chaleureusement Alexandre de nous avoir préparé ce véritable festin que nous allons déguster aujourd'hui et demain. Et en même temps, je voudrais la saluer pour tout ce qu'elle a accompli dans le domaine des études irlandaises depuis des années en Irlande, en France, en Afrique du Sud et partout dans le monde. So, with that, my talk. So we know where they came from. We know some of their names. We know where they lived in France. But what do we know about what it felt like to be a young Irish student in the schools and colleges of France from the late 18th to the late 19th century? What of their daily lives and their emotional lives? Were they happy? Did they ever feel lonely? And did they ever want to return home? I realize that these are deeply anachronistic, ahistorical questions, the kinds of questions that we now ask as a matter of course regarding the students that we send to France as Erasmus students or as postgraduates. They're born of our experiences and our priorities in trying to provide a holistic student-centered experience for these young people. But I'll ask these questions anyway. COVID has prevented me from accessing most of the material that I needed, both in Ireland and in Paris. So this has meant that I've had to fall back on two main sources of material that I had collected much earlier and for completely different purposes. The letters of the liberator Daniel O'Connell that he wrote home when he was a young student in schools in Douai and Saint-Omer in the north of France in the 1790s. And secondly, material that I accessed in the old library in the Collège des Irlandais, the Centre Culturel Irlandais in Paris, when I had the good fortune to be awarded a research fellowship there a few summers ago. But because of insufficient access to documents, I've had to adopt a pointilliste approach. A phrase here, a reference there, trying bit by bit to build up a necessarily very incomplete and possibly very inaccurate picture. My presentation is full of questions that I'll try to answer on my next visit to the Archives Nationales in Paris. For example, there's a tantalizing reference in the Archives Nationales to a passport delivered in Marseille in November 1821 to a Michael Stevens, identified as an étudiant irlandais. The interesting point here is that this crops up in a section on the surveillance of French ports and ships in the early 19th century in police records. So who was Michael Stevens and who was the unnamed Irish student who also asked for a passport in files dating from the same period? And what further details are given in the Archives Nationales documents about the Irish boursiers who were given 300 livres expenses each to go home in the late 18th century? In short, I had intended to prepare a full, rich three-course meal for you with all the trimmings, but I find myself instead being able to offer you merely some amuse-gueule, some Pringles. And if that were not enough pressure, Adding to my stress is the participation in this conference of some of the leading experts in the entire world on this material. So with this lengthy list of disclaimers and apologies, here goes. In the Irish College Paris documents from the long 19th century, much time and attention is focused on macro matters, high politics, high finance, pensions and running costs, rather than on the students for whose benefit these schools and colleges existed. Although I could add in parentheses that this may not sound particularly unfamiliar to anyone who has ever taught in a school or college. These documents read as if the students were very far from being the main focus in some implicit hierarchy of concerns. Writing to the Archbishops and Bishops of Ireland in his annual report from the Irish College 1869 to 1870, the superior of the college, Father Thomas McNamara, mentions in passing that 3 students died that year and that 5 left. He doesn't name these students, nor does he tell us how they died or why they left. He does, however, in the same report, write at length and with fury about what he castigates as reckless spending on the part of the administrator of the college on a painting and on some black marble. We read also of personality clashes, infighting between McNamara and the beleaguered administrator Charles Wansan-Croix. Here's a memorable flavour from July 1876 with McNamara castigating Saint-Ouen as, quote, an unfortunate man who had thrown away the soutane to put on a soldier's uniform and who, as I discovered lately, was living in a state of concubinage while retained by the Bureau of the Office of Administrator of the Irish Foundations and Superior of the College, end quote. If only McNamara had told us as much about the 100 or so Irish students in his care in the college at the time. In 2001, in the Collège des Irlandais Paris and Irish Studies, by leading and much lamented Irish scholar and mentor Princius McConagh, 13 of the 17 chapters focus on the upper echelon in the college over the centuries. But again, what of the far larger student cohort? Of course, the material needed to write the story of the students is far less plentiful than that available for the superiors. So different, of course, from our own times when our students live on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with 95 million Instagram posts, 350 million Facebook posts, and 500 million tweets being posted every day. But in the period under discussion here, even when material is available, it may be sidelined. In his 8-volume edition of Daniel O'Connell's letters, historian Oliver MacDonagh announces that he had discarded much of the correspondence between O'Connell and his wife because, as he said, it is full of tiresome expressions of affection. Later, during the French Revolution, just a few months before the outbreak of the aptly named year-long episode known as La Terreur, the young O'Connell managed to cross the Channel and reached London, having fled his school in Douai. From London, he wrote that he had to leave his possessions behind in his school and that, quote, when we came to London, we had every single article of wearing apparel to buy. MacDonagh at this point truncates the letter by saying here a long list of articles was enumerated, but he doesn't deem them important or interesting enough to be transcribed. In other words, he dismisses and excises matters of the heart, O'Connell's letters to his wife, and material culture, O'Connell's clothes, as he regards them as quite unimportant. At a personal level, not only would I have been interested in this discarded material, I'd make a case for its importance in piecing together a fuller picture of the liberator. So focusing on these students, what do they actually look like? A drawing that I came across from the Irish College in Salamanca from around that time shows a young Irish student dressed in a capacious soutane. If you look closely at his face, however, he looks like a very young adolescent at most. To modernize, there is something touching and even vulnerable about this representation, a child dressed up in a man's garb. So how old were these students? And again, I refer to the excellent paper of my predecessor, Liam Chambers here. Irish students on the continent who did not wish to enter clerical orders were, of course, much younger than their ordained colleagues. They often arrived in France in their mid-teens and stayed much longer. O'Connell was 15 when he started on his French adventure as a student in the north of France with his younger brother in tow. In his 2012 reflection on handwriting, The Missing Ink, The Lost Art of Handwriting and Why It Still Matters, Professor of Creative Writing, Philip Hensher, muses on how revealing, how intimate someone's handwriting can be for the reader. So do we have any traces of the handwriting of the students from this period, of the marks that they made on a page? Leaving the compulsive letter writer Daniel O'Connell aside, the closest that I've come so far is from books that originally belonged to priests in the Irish College in the 19th century in Paris, which I bought many years ago when UCC was selling them off after it bought the Vincentian Seminary and its contents in Sunday's Well in Cork. Some of them are signed and dated, sometimes in Irish, by these clerics from the Irish College. But I'm still looking for samples of the students' handwriting, of the younger students' handwriting. So what were they taught? What was their program of studies? Writing home from the kind of English prep school that he was in Saint-Omer in February 1792, O'Connell refers to the advice that his uncle, the Comte de France, had given him, and I quote, "He desired us to learn mathematics, logic, and rhetoric. As soon as I'd received his letter, I went to the president to inform him of it. He told me that the price of learning of mathematics here is £1 a month, upon which I wrote to my uncle to let him know the president's answer. In this college are taught the Latin and Greek authors, French, English, and geography, besides lessons given during recreation hours in music, dancing, fencing, and drawing." And then he adds, "I got second in Latin, Greek, and English, and 11th in French." He then includes details about oratory and public speaking, which was also on the timetable, as well as, quote, "a whole play acted in the month of August." In other words, in Saint-Omer, he was receiving a holistic, well-rounded education that would serve him well later in life. 2 months later, he gives us the list of authors he's studying: Mignot, Caesar, Cicero, Demosthenes, Homer, De Gasso, and he says that he's translating Caesar into Greek. Regarding the education a generation later of O'Connell's own son, Morgan, we read the following advice sent to O'Connell and written in French from Paris by his uncle, the Comte de France. "Your idea of putting Morgan into the French service is neither practical nor desirable," he writes. "If he has the definite vocation for an army career, he must learn mathematics, drawing, fortification, and geography, and in 4 or 5 years he will have to buy a commission. He must learn to dance and fence, and of course he must know how to speak and write French well." That was July 1819. O'Connell's children later did find themselves in France, in Pau and later in Tours, for about 18 months in 1822 to 23, a relocation inspired by O'Connell's misguided belief that the cost of living would be cheaper in France than it was in Dublin. In August 1822, the Count O'Connell advises Daniel O'Connell about the best places for his exiled family. He tells him to avoid Périgord. It's full of the new breed of those who would rule the land but pay little attention to refined education, he says. Toulouse, on the other hand, seems to have, quote, "good masters of every description." At first, O'Connell's hopes are high. We read this in a letter that he sent to his wife Mary in Bordeaux in 1822. "Tell my Nell, her father expects that she will learn Spanish and German as well as French and especially Italian. Tell my Kate I will be satisfied with her being a French and German scholar. I wish you," he says to Mary, "I wish you would retard Danny's speaking French in order not to interfere with his English." And later on, he writes, "I hope they have the opportunity of studying general and local history. They should know everything relative to France and especially to the Béarn where they were and Tours where they are. I wish my girls to read more books than you do, sweetest." He was very good with the moral pressure. As ever, his hopes regarding his sons are soon dashed. This is to Mary in Tours in June 1823. "Speak very seriously to my John for me. Tell him I am literally shocked at his being idle." And then the moral pressure. "He shall not have my fondness if he does not give up idleness at once and forever. I work 15 or 16 hours out of 24. I will ask him only to work 5 or 6. As for the materiality of students' lives, furniture emerges as perhaps an unexpected concern. Again, this is O'Connell, September 1792, from his school in Douai. He writes, as soon as we arrived, we got each a room, so himself and his brother, we got each a room in which there was no furniture except a bed, for every boy is supposed to bring furniture with him to furnish his own room. So he had to borrow money, 1.5 guineas, and he said that with that, he bought most of the little things necessary for our rooms, such as looking glasses, candlesticks, wash basins, etc. But we did not have money enough to buy knives, forks, etc. for the refectory. This meant borrowing more money, and with more money borrowed, he was able, quote, he says, this provided us with furniture even before we got the letter from you, meaning more money, and so that we have got tables. The furniture consists of a desk and cupboard, a stall, a small table for washing, powdering, etc., and 4 chairs. Writing later from London, March 1793, London to which he had just escaped with his brother, he explains, we left most of our furniture together with my violin to be sold, but they have been seized by the municipalité, as was every other article which was not particular, which had not its particular owner then present, all such goods being considered as national property. As for the furniture of the students in the Irish College in Paris, their mattresses, references to their mattresses crop up in the Archives Nationales. They appear to have sold their mattresses, which were about to be confiscated from them by the revolutionaries. The everyday care of their material possessions also features. O'Connell, writing from Douai as opposed to Saint-Omer, says this. He says, we are obliged, this is September 1792, we're obliged to pay for the washing ourselves. At Saint-Omer, everything was done for the boys. Here, meaning in Douai, we're obliged to do everything for ourselves. And back in the Irish College, there's a quote that I really like from July 1871, July 1871, and from the proviseur. He says, j'ai donné à blanchir toutes les couvertures des lits chez votre blanchisseur. J'ai fait nettoyer et plier toutes les soutanes que les élèves avaient laissées crochées à leur porte-manteau. Je continuais à mettre de l'ordre en ordre vos matelas et sommiers. So there's a very poignant image of an empty college the students had left because of the Franco-Prussian War, and their clothes have been laundered and are waiting for them, and the proviseur is clearly pining for them to come back. Perhaps unsurprisingly, references to food crop up frequently. The Irish College in Paris documents include exquisite drawings of the colleges and grounds of their country house in Arcueil, just on the outskirts of Paris, where much of the food needed for the college was grown. In December 1868, for instance, a new carriage was bought to transport garden produce from Arcueil to the house in Paris, a reference that conjures up the weight and volume of the produce in question. O'Connell's letters provide a different take from his own first-hand experience of living in a French school. There's his astonishment that he's allowed to eat meat during Lent. And then he complains that in Douai, quote, we got very small portions at dinner. So he asks his Derrynane uncle to provide yet more money so that he and his younger brother could get second portions of food, which cost more. The health and overall well-being of the students were clearly an ongoing concern. The Irish College documents refer to un jeu de balle de nos élèves, so a sports area, and attention was paid to ensuring that their surroundings were pleasant. The Irish College documents refer to flowers, rose bushes, and trees growing in the main courtyard, and particularly to chestnut trees that were over 300 years old and under which people would congregate. Interestingly, both the Irish College in Paris and O'Connell School in Douai had country houses to which the students could escape the city into the fresher country air. Here is O'Connell writing home from Saint-Omer in the summer of 1792. Our school goes tomorrow to our country house. We are to remain there 4 days, which are by far the pleasantest in the year. The house is situated in a beautiful valley about a league from the town called Blamdyke. All the boys go there once a fortnight and remain a day. This renders the summer very agreeable. 100 years later, during the Franco-Prussian War, The house in Arcueil outside Paris was looted and seriously damaged. And as McNamara explains, as a consequence, the students are obliged either to spend their vacation here in town to the great detriment of their health, or to go home to Ireland at so much more expense and inconvenience. Things hadn't particularly improved by the end of the 19th century. June 1897, there's a document, a visitation report that noted, quote, that it must strike anyone acquainted with the needs of college life that in the Irish college there is very poor provision for the recreation of the students. We're of the opinion that if some system could be devised whereby the students might have more frequent opportunities of going into the country or the open spaces of the city, it would tend greatly to their physical well-being, end quote. In 1870, Asiatic cholera and typhoid outbreaks, as well as sheer bad weather in Paris, confined everyone to the college. But again, of all the documents that I looked at in the Irish College, probably the most fascinating, fleeting comment was one from the early 1870. There's a fleeting comment to a Dr. Lanois who, quote, brought a young heifer into the recreation hall where all appeared and received vaccination. The first time I read this, I thought I was hallucinating, like a heifer, brought a young heifer into the main hall in the Irish College. But actually, I discovered what happened was that late in 1869, smallpox appeared in French provinces and soon escalated into an epidemic that killed 500,000 people over the next 5 years. It was actually shortly into this epidemic in July 1870 that France declared war on Prussia. Severe outbreaks of typhoid fever, dysentery, and other infectious diseases were already striking soldiers on both sides, but to quote medical historians Matthew Smallman Rayner and Andrew D. Cliff of Nottingham and Cambridge, these outbreaks were dwarfed by an epidemic of smallpox that ripped through the military and civil populations of France and the Allied States of Germany. So in steps Dr. Lanois, he of the Irish College reference. The groundbreaking work on smallpox by English Dr. Edward Jenner in the 1790s was not taken seriously by the medical profession until the arrival of Gustave Lanois and his fellow scientist Ernest Chambon. In 1864, they brought a calf infected with cowpox from Naples to Paris in order to establish a vaccination center, and their work constituted a breakthrough. I find it fascinating that relatively early in the outbreak in Paris, amid intensifying political tension, which would soon result in the outbreak of war, the Irish College in Paris took the proactive step of contacting probably the leading expert in smallpox vaccine in all of France, and of inviting him and his heifer into the college recreation hall to vaccinate the whole community. Fears of radical ideals arriving in Ireland from the continent via Irish clerics have, of course, been analysed at length. After all, it is said of Nan O'Neill that it was the time that she spent in Paris as a young woman in the mid-18th century that convinced her to come back home to Cork and set up a school for the children of the poor, a school that has since grown into a worldwide network now with 36,000 students. Be that as it may, a different story emerges from the admittedly fragmentary documents that I've been able to consult so far in the Irish, in fact, in these documents, what has struck me more than anything else was the policy of containment seemingly operated in order to ensure that the Irish students didn't go native, didn't catch any radical ideals from their surroundings. For one thing, they looked different. The clothing they had to wear was a marker of their otherness. O'Connell writes that on his flight to Calais, the carriage in which he was travelling risked being attacked as the clothes he was wearing could identify him as a student from a Catholic school. And at the end of the following century, a scandalised commentator in the Irish College documents complains that, quote, on the first day of vacation, some students remain in Paris and in the evening frequent low theatres and other objectionable places of amusement, as they are recognized by Parisians and easily known to be ecclesiastical students, scandal is given. The community in which these students lived in France was in France, but not of it. In O'Connell's letters, the names of the school staff and fellow pupils are exclusively Irish. of his Douai college, he says, French is paid no great attention there, nay, almost totally neglected. If they were marked out as looking and sounding different, out of step with people outside their community, so too where they lived was somehow different elsewhere. The Irish College is repeatedly depicted as an oasis, a stretch of countryside in the middle of a busy city. The very architecture of the Irish College intensified this separateness and ensured that the students remained apart. In fact, it's a prime example of the architecture of containment. The black and white photos of the college taken around 1905-1906 by renowned pioneering documentary photographer Eugène Atquet emphasize its massive closed door, its solid high walls. We get the impression of a dour, impenetrable fortress, no way of guessing what happened behind there. The college was not just enclosed, however, though in France it saw itself as not French but Irish, an Irish compound in the heart of Paris. We read this from the 1870s. Or le seuil de cette porte, vieille de 300 ans, c'est la France. Mais au-dedans de ce même seuil, c'est l'Empire britannique, c'est l'Angleterre, l'Écosse et l'Irlande réunies sous le même puissant drapeau. Writing to His Majesty's Secretary for Foreign Affairs around 1870, the archbishops and bishops of Ireland could not be clearer. No French ecclesiastical student has ever been admitted into this college, nor has one ever studied there. This is a genuine foreign colony. It has never lost that character. It has lived by means of monies coming from foreigners, which were administered according to French decrees, an establishment composed of foreigners and for foreigners. During the Franco-Prussian War, to emphasize this point, a statement proclaiming that cet établissement appartient depuis 300 ans à la nation irlandaise is posted on its walls. And during the Franco-Prussian War, again and again, we read that the British flag was flown over the college and over its house in Arcueil, a marker of difference from their surroundings and a kind of talisman conferring protection from danger. Beyond student garb and student walls, what, if anything, can we glimpse from these fleeting references of the inner life of the young people? Were they happy in France, or did they ever want to go home? Again, this is probably a question that makes absolutely no sense when looking at the period when childhood was short and people entered adulthood and at a very young age. I refer here, of course, to the work on the invention of childhood by people like Philippe Ariès and others, and to historians of emotions. In the case of O'Connell, he was not yet 16 in 1791 when, with his younger brother in tow, he was dispatched from his small school in Cork Harbour to the Low Countries and onwards into northern France without first returning home to Kerry to say goodbye or collect his belongings. He had to, sorry.
Grace, just sorry not to interrupt you. How are we doing in terms of, are we wrapping up?
I'm going to wrap up. Okay. So
if you could, please.
Okay, so there are some glimpses of his emotions, and likewise, again, in the Irish College, in the Archives Nationales documents, and we find the voices of the Irish students when they get into trouble and when they complain. So I suppose in a sense, okay, sorry, Eamon, I'll wrap up there. And I had a conclusion where I was going to refer to a decree signed by Napoleon about the Irish College, but I think I'll just leave it there. Thank you very much.